Hello, I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I am delighted to welcome you all to today's Kurt Viermet's lecture, The Rights of the Displaced in a World of Conflict, Chaos and Dysfunction, Progress or Peril or Both, which will be delivered by our Kurt Viermet's distinguished visitor, Eric Schwarz. The Kurt Viermet's distinguished visitorship was established in honor of the late Kurt Viermet, passed away in 2016. He was the former chairman of J.P. Morgan, and it was established in recognition of his exceptional career in international finance and his strong dedication to the transatlantic relationship. The program was inaugurated originally, well before his passing, to bring outstanding U.S. individuals from a range of policy fields to the American Academy for an in-depth exchange with German colleagues, counterparts, and the interested public. Former Viermet's distinguished visitors include David Lipton of the International Monetary Fund, Todd Stern, the former Special Envoy for Climate Change at the U.S. Department of State, and former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers. Let me now turn to our speaker. It is a great pleasure to introduce Eric Schwarz tonight, since he has been a friend of more than 25 years, which is not something we like to say out loud, and someone who I've admired tremendously for many, many years. Eric and I met when we shared adjacent suites in the old executive office building during the Clinton administration. He was then director and eventually senior director for multilateral affairs, and it was in those days that I learned that multilateral affairs meant that the world's problems, the ones that were so intractable that no 1, 2, or 10 countries wanted to take them on by themselves. Peacekeeping, international disaster relief, destabilizing refugee flows, complex humanitarian responses to crises in places such as northern Iraq, East Timor, Kosovo, and Central America, and you name it, Eric had to take care of it. For some reason, the names that we give people who have worked insane hours and even more insane years come to us from the communist world. But I hope Eric will take it as a tribute to his dedication when I say he was a true long marcher in those efforts. And even, some of you will know the term, a Stakhanovite. Do you remember that one, Eric? Named after the legendary Soviet coal miner who was meant to be a model for everyone in the former USSR. He spent a full 8 years in the Clinton White House, which by all rights ought to have been biologically impossible. And then he stayed on a few more weeks in the George W. Bush administration to help in that delayed transition, another sign of his humanitarianism, I would say. After leaving government, he served as chief of office in Geneva for the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and then as the United Nations Secretary General's Deputy Special Envoy for Tsunami Recovery. I had the pleasure of serving again with Eric during the Obama administration when he was U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. Is that the longest of all the assistant secretary titles? I think it might be. During his tenure, he strengthened the State Department's humanitarian advocacy around the world and raised the profile of global migration issues in U.S. foreign policy. I remember vividly how Eric dealt with such unforgiving tasks as figuring out how to provide security screening for refugees from Iraq who were being resettled in the U.S., a true mission impossible in a country that wanted absolutely zero risk of terrorist infiltration. He also had the thankless task of trying to get food to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of refugees in areas where extremist groups routinely pilfered the supplies for resale, a phenomenon that triggered the suspension of aid. After he left government, Eric served a 6-year term as dean of the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, and subsequently, he spent 6 years as the president, 5 years, 6 years? 5. Right, 5 years as the president of Refugees International, the eminent NGO based in Washington that is devoted to advocating for the world's refugees. So we were very fortunate to find a short window in time to bring Eric to Berlin before he is again working to help some of the world's most vulnerable people, as I am absolutely certain he will. There are, of course, millions of people on the move in the world today, and those people have legitimate rights and legitimate needs. In addition, their movements can profoundly affect regional stability and global politics in all kinds of ways. As the earth warms, we can expect there will be many more of them, and we don't appear to be ready for them in the least. So I am really pleased that Eric Schwarz is here in Berlin to discuss with us the dimensions of the problem and the outlines for what might be a set of solutions. Before I give the podium to Eric, let me just tell you a little bit about the roadmap for the evening ahead. Eric will talk for about 40 minutes. You can set your watches, and that will be followed by an audience Q&A. If you are here, you know how to handle that situation. If you are joining us via Zoom, please do not raise your hand at home, or do not raise your hand on your Zoom screen. Instead, please use the Q&A function on the Zoom platform, and we apologize in advance if we don't get to all the questions. And now, Eric, the podium is yours.
I want to thank the American Academy for the opportunity to offer this presentation. I want to thank you, Dan. What a wonderful opportunity this has been. Thanks also to Berit Ebert. Thanks also to Mareike Klaus, who so carefully developed my itinerary, and to the staff of the Academy. And let me say that this is not the Humphrey School of Public Affairs with which I'm associated. So I contemplated deleting the image you see of Hubert Humphrey, who served in the U.S. Senate and was the 38th President of the United States. But as Humphrey was a campaigner for immigration reform as early as 1952, I thought I would just keep his image. And it's a real pleasure for me to address you all in Berlin and online on this overly ambitious topic, the rights of the displaced, and whether we're seeing progress or peril. Of course, the answer will be both, but the more important question is how to assess what we're seeing and what progress is needed. So let me start with an observation, that there are at least three sets of imperatives that underlie considerations of how governments, how civil society, how affected people believe they should deal with forced migration. There is the imperative of humanity, the notion that human suffering wherever it occurs, human dignity wherever it is at risk, must command the attention of all humankind. That proposition is baked into United Nations documents and articulated policies of national governments, as reflected, for example, in the stated principles of the Good Humanitarian Donorship Initiative, an informal grouping of major donor states. There's also the perspective that increasingly comes from affected communities themselves, that individuals who are fleeing human rights abuses or disaster are not victims depending on the kindness of others, but rather rights holders with legitimate demands. Then there are political, foreign policy, and national security interests as perceived by governments. Many governments would argue, I would argue, that these interests on the one hand and the imperative of humanity and human rights on the other don't conflict with one another. But whether or not there are irreconcilable conflicts, there certainly are tensions that arise, as this image depicts. And the challenge of vindicating each of these sets of objectives will underlie almost all that follows over the next 37 minutes or so. And now on to all that follows. At the end of 2021, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees estimated that there were some 89 million people forcibly displaced globally as a result of conflict, persecution, violations of human rights, the majority of whom were displaced within their own countries, with about 27 million displaced as refugees, that is, beyond the borders of their home countries. The remainder of the 89 million were those seeking asylum in host countries, as well as Venezuelans outside of Venezuela, the bulk of whom are not categorized as refugees by UNHCR, as the reasons for their flight vary so significantly. But of course, that 89 million figure itself changed dramatically in 2022, in particular by the war in Ukraine. And UNHCR estimated in the spring of this year that there were some 100 million forcibly displaced persons around the world. These images are taken from a report of a trip that I took with two refugees international colleagues, Daphne Panayotatos and Irla Atanda, shortly after the Russian invasion. In fact, and drawing primarily from UNHCR figures, just 6 countries are the source of the large majority of the world's refugees. Ukrainians who have fled Ukraine now number perhaps about 8 million. Syrians are at about 6.8 million, Afghans at about 2.7 million, South Sudanese at about 2.4 million, and Burmese about 1.2 million. And for this presentation, I'm also including Venezuelans, of whom there are perhaps 6 million outside of Venezuela. Most of the world's refugees live in protracted displacement. Some have a relatively high degree of protection, such as Venezuelans in Colombia or Syrians and others here in Germany. But if you are, say, a Syrian refugee in Lebanon, chances are you live both in poverty and in fear of deportation. And if you are one of about 1 million Rohingya in Bangladesh, your conditions are very fragile at best, and for many, quite dire. About a third of the total worldwide population of refugees are hosted in just 7 countries: Turkey, Colombia, Uganda, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sudan, and Germany. In terms of the internally displaced, again, who now number upwards of 60 million, about 2/3 are within 8 countries. That is, within their own countries, including Ukrainians in Ukraine, Syrians, Congolese in the DRC, Colombians, Yemenis, Ethiopians, and Burkina Faso in Burkina Faso. So overall, the challenges with respect to refugees and IDPs are not evenly distributed, with responsibilities assumed primarily by the displaced themselves and less affluent countries around the world. And while these challenges seem daunting, it is worth remembering that 100 million, as large a number as it is, represents about 1.25% of world population. Before I talk about both internal displacement and forced migration across borders, I want to address one obvious question. And that's why a presentation that involves so many issues related to conflict doesn't tackle head-on the issue of conflict prevention and conflict resolution. After all, it was Sadako Ogata, the former UN High Commissioner for Refugees, with whom I had the honor of working when I was at the NSC. It was Sadako Ogata who declared that there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems, that such problems can only be fully addressed in the realm of politics and security. Oops, there we go. There is truth to that sentiment, and so much work to be done to prevent and ameliorate conflict. But if past is prologue, as I believe it is, no matter how well governments do in addressing conflict, there will still be many millions of individuals who will be on the move. And they need protection and durable solutions with or without resolution of the root causes of their flight. So I'll begin with a discussion of internally displaced people. Like refugees, internally displaced people have fled their homes, but unlike refugees, IDPs, as they're called, are in many cases moving to communities where the reception they receive is uncertain at best. And while there are about double the number of internally displaced people in the world as compared to refugees, IDPs have not received a commensurate level of attention and resources from donors. It doesn't help that there isn't a strong international legal framework focused on the rights of internally displaced people. But such individuals, at least in theory, do enjoy the protections of both domestic laws and international human rights law. Beyond that, the guiding principles on internal displacement developed by the UN and other experts some 3 decades ago provide a set of requirements largely reflecting existing human rights law, in particular while recognizing that national authorities have primary responsibility for aiding their population. The guiding principles declare that offers of assistance from international humanitarian organizations cannot be arbitrarily denied, that there should be free passage of humanitarian goods, that those providing assistance should be respected and protected, and the principles were presented to the UN Human Rights Commission in 1998 and were welcomed by the General Assembly. Nonetheless, addressing the needs and the rights of internally displaced people comes with special challenges, not the least of which are access to populations in places like Syria, the DRC, Yemen, South Sudan, and lack of knowledge of the circumstances of particular IDP populations. So I now want to turn to a story that both illustrates some of the challenges in this area and involves the founder of the American Academy, Richard Holbrooke. In 1999, Richard visited Angola. I'm not sure this is Richard in Angola. It may be Richard in Bosnia, but it's a picture of Richard. In any event, when he was there, he was appalled at the disparity of treatment between refugees from the DRC, who had a system in place to address their needs, and the treatment of internally displaced Angolans, who did not. He lamented the lack of coherent organization in the international effort to address IDP needs, and he called for consolidation of responsibility for IDP issues within the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. In fact, while that objective was not achieved, in the decade that followed, the UN and member governments implemented a range of reforms that at least impacted management of these issues, including the unfortunately named cluster system, aimed at strengthening management and coordination with different agencies assigned different leadership roles in international humanitarian responses within countries. But it was not consolidation of responsibility for IDPs into one agency, and nobody would argue that the challenges were ever wholly addressed. Despite Richard Holbrooke moving on to other issues, he didn't forget this one. And in fact, he felt that the very term IDP itself was, and I quote, sterile and bureaucratic, and failed to convey the compelling circumstances of the people it was describing. In 2009, when he was Special Envoy for Pakistan and Afghanistan, I was Assistant Secretary for Refugees. I well remember Richard, or his staff working at his behest, but probably Richard, referring in cables to internal refugees. Of course, this phrase is a legal contradiction in terms. If you are a refugee, you're outside your country of origin. But I certainly did not try to change the phrase. A victory, albeit very small and probably short-lived, in Ambassador Holbrooke's effort to emphasize the humanity of this population. The management and organizational issues are real, but there's more to IDP policy challenges than better international coordination. And that's the fact that IDPs are generally citizens of the state in which they are displaced, and governments jealous of their sovereignty can be very reluctant to delegate authority to international organizations. We recently saw this in the debate that took place in July around renewal of cross-border assistance from Turkey into northwest Syria to help Syrians. Nonetheless, there has been at least some recent movement on this issue. In 2019, the Secretary General established a high-level panel on internal displacement, and the 2021 report of the panel contained a range of, I'd say, helpful recommendations. The report called for greater national and international efforts to integrate internally displaced people into national development planning, increased donor financing, a greater role for IDP populations in decisions impacting their lives, strengthen international efforts to ensure the basic rights of IDPs, and it called for the appointment of a special representative of the Secretary General, or SRSG, on solutions for internal displacement. A recommendation that I and 6 other former U.S. government humanitarian officials had urged, in our case, before the report was published. And while the Secretary General didn't go so far as to appoint an SRSG, he did appoint a seasoned UN official, Robert Piper of Australia, as his special advisor on solutions to internal displacement. Robert, whom I know and with whom I have worked closely, as it happens, is deeply knowledgeable, a determined humanitarian, and is a very strong choice for this position. In June, the Secretary General took another step, issuing an action agenda on internal displacement, echoing many of the themes of the panel report. But the challenge will be to press donors effectively to dramatically augment assistance that enables internally displaced people to address humanitarian and development needs. There'll be a bit more on this later, but first we'll move to forced migration across borders, which poses its own unique set of political, economic, and social challenges and opportunities. And I'll begin with the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. It's important to start here because of everything that will and in this presentation and has in the world evolved. That convention was developed in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the Second World War and resulting displacement, not only of Jews, but of people of so many other nationalities. The convention and its protocol define a refugee as a person who is outside their country of origin and has a well-founded fear of persecution, severe mistreatment due to race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and owing to that fear is unable and unwilling to return. Now, a bedrock requirement of the Convention is its Article 33, which prohibits the return of a refugee to a place where their life or freedom may be threatened on account of these grounds. But one doesn't need to be a refugee expert to know that if the Convention's standard were the sole basis on which people who need to flee could actually flee, protection would be wholly inadequate. In fact, most of the 30 to 35 million people around the world we might regard as refugees, so many of whom are fleeing conflict, might not meet this standard. Beyond that, there are at least tens of millions who are going to be displaced within and beyond the borders of their countries due to disasters borne by natural hazards, exacerbated by climate change. As reflected in the report, Climate Change 2022 impacts adaptation and vulnerability. This is the expert working group, talk about long titles, contribution to the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But this report was significant because of what it said about dramatic impacts that are upon us already. The report declares with high confidence that climate change is contributing to humanitarian crises where climate hazards interact with high vulnerability, that climate and weather extremes are increasingly driving displacement in all regions, with small island states disproportionately affected, and that approximately 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. And these are reports of the Climate Displacement Program of the Organization from which I just departed, Refugees International, giving more of a sense of just how people's lives have been affected by drought in Ethiopia and cyclones in Mozambique and Zimbabwe. In fact, there has been some recognition in domestic and international law and practice of an imperative for protection for those forced to flee for reasons that go beyond the criteria of the Refugee Convention. First, UNHCR and governments have made judgments that some populations fleeing conflict and other disasters either have prima facie refugee status as a formal matter, or ought to be considered refugees as a practical matter until a determination to the contrary, or ought to be protected from forced return because of what might await them at home, effectively creating a broad expectation of protection. Some, like Alex Alenikov and Leah Zamor in a monograph called The Arc of Protection, have essentially argued, perhaps optimistically, that this really has become international practice. And there are other measures that reflect recognition that a broader category of people may be forced to migrate and merit protection. There is the Global Compact on Migration, adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations about 4 years ago, and recognizing the need to provide for and promote the human rights of people displaced by climate, people who are trafficked, and others who might not meet the narrow refugee definition. There is the Cartagena Declaration on Refugees, adopted by Latin American countries in 1984, which expands the refugee definition to include those who have fled their country because their lives, safety, or freedom have been threatened by circumstances which have seriously disrupted the public order. And the declaration has been incorporated, if not completely implemented, into the laws of most governments in Latin America. There is the 1969 Organization of African Unity Convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa, which includes in its definition of refugee people who, due to events seriously disturbing public order, are compelled to flee and seek refuge. There are a range of avenues in Europe and elsewhere through which those who fear harm can obtain status and protection. In the United States, we have provisions that authorize permission to stay for those who are in the United States or are seeking entry and who have legitimate fears about returning to their countries of origin. And there are so-called migration pathway efforts. That is, the use of regular migration programs, such as those relating to employment visas, that can benefit those who are compelled to migrate. And there is no shortage of valuable scholarship, analysis, and advocacy around more aspirational and transformational change. Get ready for your shout out, Michael. That would universalize and expand these measures. As reflected, for example, in a model international mobility convention for which one of our guests tonight, Michael Doyle, has been so responsible. And also as reflected, to cite another example, in the analysis and advocacy in the Arc of Protection, the book I mentioned a few moments ago. But admittedly, we're not quite there yet. But we have seen in recent years examples of inclusion within the spirit, I believe, of these more aspirational objectives. For instance, Colombia is currently host to upwards of 2 million Venezuelans and has taken measures toward regularization of their status. In 2015 and 16, German authorities admitted more than 1 million people to Germany to seek asylum. In other parts of the world, from Ecuador to Uganda to Rwanda and beyond, there have been meaningful efforts to enable refugees to work, to realize their ambitions for themselves and their families, often aided by programs of UNHCR, of the World Bank, and others. And of course, many millions of Ukrainians have found temporary refuge outside of Ukraine. All of these examples, and more I could cite, have come with challenges, but they're nonetheless encouraging. At the same time, troubling and even disheartening developments may be more significant. First, there is externalization of asylum, an anodyne phrase for a nasty set of practices that prevent asylum seekers from either seeking asylum at borders or even approaching borders, and which expose asylum seekers to abuse. Judith Sutherland of Human Rights Watch recently lamented an abdication of EU responsibilities in this regard. She wrote, and I quote, "Despite overwhelming evidence of horrific detention and abuse of migrants in Libya, the EU supports the Libyan forces' efforts to detect boats and pull people back. EU governments and institutions have largely turned a blind eye to unlawful and dangerous pushbacks of boats to Turkey by Greece in the Aegean," end quote. And in the United States, a Biden-Harris campaign that really boasted about plans for dramatic change has faced challenges preventing swift implementation of reforms. And there are still asylum seekers being turned away at the U.S. southern border based on Trump administration restrictions. Beyond externalization, there is the troubling reality that the support that Ukrainians have received in Europe and beyond has not been matched by support for other populations on the move, as reflected in this statement from my former organization about disparities between aid to Ukrainians and aid to Venezuelans. The answer, of course, is not to bring down aid to Ukrainians, but to bring up aid for everyone else. On a related issue, resettlement, in which countries like the United States agree to provide durable solutions to refugees who have been living in uncertain conditions in countries of temporary refuge, UNHCR estimates that about 5% of the world's refugees, about 1.5 million people, are in need of resettlement. And it's troubling that countries have failed to resettle more than the tiniest fraction of this total annually. In the United States, even as President Biden authorized admission of more than 200,000 Afghans and Ukrainians through special parole programs, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program has so far failed to resettle significant numbers after the awful experience of President Trump's anti-refugee policies. So the overall picture, as I foreshadowed, is quite mixed. And it is, of course, complicated because just about everywhere, migration is a wedge political issue, with loud voices of intolerance appealing to, well, to our fears rather than our hopes and aspirations. So what does this all mean? Well, my final observations are grounded in several beliefs. A belief in the importance of internationally recognized human rights and of the institutions that fortify respect for those rights. A belief that moving forward on this agenda advances both critical values and interests of governments like the United States and Germany. And a belief that, especially if you're working in public institutions, like government, the best outcome often, perhaps usually, should not become the enemy of the good outcome. In government, you can indeed decide that what you can achieve is just not good enough, and then resign and even resign in protest. But until you do, and especially on these sets of issues, you're going to be working to achieve outcomes that are inevitably less than optimal. In any event, the breadth of this presentation creates certain challenges with respect to recommendations, as each of the areas implicated by this presentation, and here are only some of them, but each lends itself, literally, to dozens of policy recommendations. That, of course, would not be very feasible, you don't want to be here all night, or even meaningful in a presentation like this. So perhaps better to be less ambitious and call this part of the talk concluding thoughts. So I don't have to commit to comprehensiveness, but rather can reflect on key items that might be, in my mind, say, were I about to re-enter a leadership position in government, the UN, or an NGO or a nonprofit? And I'll start with the question of engagement of affected communities. Governments, NGOs, foundations, and others in countries around the world need to walk the walk, and I'm borrowing the subtitle of a Refugees International report written some years ago, walk the walk on inclusion of affected populations in activities that so impact their lives, whether it's supporting refugee participation in international negotiations, funding refugee-led organizations, or ensuring that 25% of humanitarian funding goes to local and national providers. The last reflected in a so-called grand bargain between donors and NGOs from 2016. These agenda items have not moved quickly at all. The Bureau I formerly led, Population, Refugees, and Migration, has a multi-billion-dollar budget, for example. Why not create a $50 million, $100 million fund exclusively for support of refugee-led organizations? Second, on the challenge of promoting the well-being of internally displaced. As I've mentioned, there are so many reasons for skepticism about progress in this area. And it's frankly not a good sign that the Secretary General's action agenda on IDPs pays homage to agency concerns about turf, when it notes that the special advisor on IDP solutions will have no operational authority while being an advocate for system reform. The Secretary General's report calls for a new commitment to funding in this area and a plan by the end of September, a target that, not surprisingly, has been missed. So what to do, other than going back to Richard Holbrooke's initial idea of making one UN agency responsible for all of these activities? At this point, the most realistic avenue for movement would be a dramatic increase in funding for development solutions for both internally displaced people and the communities that host them. Such funding can support far greater assistance, provide crucial policy leverage, and strengthen data collection so necessary for targeted interventions. And we have a model for this kind of initiative, which has been extremely effective. The World Bank Window for Refugees and Host Communities. And it is obvious to me that the bank, supported by donors, should set up a similar scheme for IDPs. Hang on. There we go. If only it were so simple. On refugee rights, broadly, a recommendation to donor governments especially, to practice at home what you preach abroad. If you're applauding governments like Colombia, like Uganda, for accepting forced migrants and not pushing them back, you probably ought to behave similarly. Within government, reminding senior officials of the need for consistency can be influential, even if not always wholly persuasive. In preparing this presentation, I remembered, or was reminded, of making just such a consistency argument prior to I'm going to age myself here, prior to the 1993 presidential inauguration in a meeting on Haiti that was led by President-elect Clinton and Vice President-elect Al Gore. I, along with Brian Atwood, who's a good ally to have, and was going to become USAID administrator ultimately, we were urging that the door remain open on changing a direct refugee return practice of the former administration, even if the president-elect wasn't prepared to act immediately. As you see, the door was left open by the statement the president ultimately made. The, quote, for the time being formulation, which enabled us to fight the battle another day and ultimately develop a policy that I personally felt comfortable defending at the time. And as this piece from 2002 suggests, working in this field and in government causes one to think a lot about this consistency issue. On responsibility sharing versus externalization, Responsibility sharing is a legitimate effort among rights-respecting governments to distribute obligations for refugee protection equitably, and I think in some cases it's absolutely critical. Externalization is a responsibility abrogating measure that violates the rights of asylum seekers. So how to tell one from the other? Well, UNHCR has a pretty good paper on the factors that should be brought to bear, but usually, to my mind, it's not difficult to discern when you have externalization. To paraphrase former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, when he was talking about something else, you know it when you see it. Of course, there are close calls, but supporting a Libyan Coast Guard that is returning people to Libya to detention in dreadful conditions isn't really a close call. And these kinds of practices worldwide are now so pervasive that I think they do merit an international meeting with UNHCR and governments that claim to support refugee rights. A meeting not to establish new law, but to highlight existing legal safeguards that should guide government behavior. On expanding the global norms and indeed laws around who merits protection and the right to migrate, I'm encouraged by what I think has been some progressive development of norms in this area, which suggest expanded protections. And I would encourage this organic growth, maybe not a rush to seek broad endorsement of an ambitious agenda on new global norms, as I am frankly concerned such an effort might result in discord and even an outcome endorsing greater restrictions. Again, to mention Michael, as Michael Doyle has suggested, there may be a time to move forward with, say, a coalition of like-minded governments on elements of an international mobility or elements of an international mobility convention, perhaps along the lines of the effort around the Landmines Convention, which experts and advocates certainly see as a model of a coalition of the willing approach. I believe there is a critical role for the research community, valuable under any circumstances, but also helpful in that so much of the empirical work tends to support analyses suggesting that immigration has played an extremely valuable role in the economic growth and development of countries like the United States and Germany. And in both our countries, there are institutions that are responsible for valuable work in this area. But that community, to my mind, must do more to translate research into findings that can be both used by policymakers and helpful in the broader public debate. And this, of course, brings me to my last concluding thought on the political challenge and public engagement and education on refugee issues and forced migration. That these are political wedge issues shouldn't be particularly surprising, though this is a very daunting point in history. On the other hand, in the United States, we have long had such voices of intolerance. We no longer have the Know-Nothing Party of the 19th century, or demagogues like Charles Edward Coghlan in the 20th century, who reportedly had tens of millions of followers listening to his anti-Semitic and restrictionist rants. Nor do we have Breckinridge Long, the State Department official, who fought attempts to secure immigration of Jewish refugees. But we do have our contemporary restrictionists and voices of intolerance. And there is a debate with obvious historical analogs about how voices of reason, of liberalism, of tolerance should engage when there is understandable concern that strong expressions of support, say, for welcoming the stranger, will excite even louder expressions of intolerance. The challenge is ever present. It's ongoing. And it seems to me that the solution, whatever it is, cannot be to duck and cover. In fact, I fear that when voices of reason and humanity refrain from public advocacy, they don't prevent the forces of intolerance from coming to the fore, but rather give such voices a clearer path. In the United States, we have new capacities to provide information about contributions of immigrants and refugees to the fabric of American society, and there are organizations that have increasingly sought to build the constituency on behalf of support for refugees and other initiatives. I'm also aware of some efforts in Europe and in Germany, but all of our efforts are nascent at best and underfunded and inadequate. Public engagement and education efforts must be expanded dramatically, and political leaders and government officials at all levels have to be speaking out and advocating around these issues, again, supported by broader public education efforts. Such an approach, I think, best reflects both the interests and the values that should guide and animate both of our societies and societies around the world. Thank you.
I thought I would just start off with one quick question while everyone in the audience formulates theirs. And that is, as someone who's been working in this space for so many years, I want to ask you, what works in arguments? What works with ordinary citizens, and what works with government officials?
I think different
That's
strategies
why I gave you
work
two
with each.
different.
I think, the best perspectives on this issue, the most informed perspectives, are people who are most deeply engaged in this issue, and my own personal observation and experience is that that you break down prejudices and biases by contact and engagement. And so, the Welcome U.S. effort, which is a very substantial effort supported by the Open Society Foundation and other groups, is sort of predicated on the notion that we need to connect communities with refugees who are entering them. And that's why they have, as part of their effort, a very significant kind of private sponsorship approach with government support. I think that I don't question. I think the tools that you use in different societies are going to vary based on things like the extent of your social insurance program for incoming people, for incoming refugees, and other factors. But I don't really challenge. I support the idea that when Americans, Germans, others have personal contact with refugees who come in and play productive roles in their society, I think that does help to break down prejudice. And the Welcome U.S. effort is a big experiment in that regard. My own personal view is, given the very limited, as compared to, say, Germany, given the limited sort of public support, governmental support for refugees, it's not trivial or insignificant, but it pales in comparison to the benefits that a refugee who comes to Germany gets. I think this effort at private sponsorship has got to make sure that the communities that are being asked to support refugees are adequately supported financially. Otherwise, it's going to take too much out of them. But that's sort of a detail. I think the overall strategy, to my mind, makes great sense. With government officials, I believe my experience working in government has been that American officials don't like to feel that they are taking actions that are violative of rights. or that are inconsistent with what we are saying to the rest of the world. They do it. It happens. It happens quite often. But I think those are the kinds of arguments that I have certainly made to officials in administrations in which I have worked. I also think you have to make the case to a senior official that what you are advocating is feasible. Because if it's not feasible, you just have or if it doesn't seem very feasible, you just have a higher hill to climb. I'll give you an example, if I may. When both the NGOs and I'll go back to the Haiti case, both the NGOs and some folks in the State Department, I won't go into all the details, but at a certain point in the migration crisis, NGOs and others in the State Department were urging that we adopt a safe haven approach for Haitians. This is what I refer to in my remarks. We were screening refugees for admission, and a third of the screening asylum seekers and a third of the Haitians who were coming out were being screened in, and the numbers were just were significant and for policymakers sort of overwhelming, and was also having an impact on the broader effort to address the Cedros dictatorship. So I argued to the Deputy National Security Advisor that a safe haven approach made a lot of sense, because you basically say anyone who wants to flee Haiti can flee Haiti, and we will give you safe haven, as it happens at Guantanamo. And Guantanamo has a very negative connotation, but we'd give you safe haven at Guantanamo, and then at the end of the conflict, we would figure out what to do. And I remember the Deputy National Security Advisor, who has passed on, said to me, "Wait, you're saying to me now a third of the people are coming in and 2/3 are being returned, and now you're saying we're going to let everyone come out and it's not going to be a worse situation?" And my response was, I can't predict for certain, but I think this is going to create a situation in which those who flee really need safety in a conflict environment. And God bless Sandy Berger, he said, okay, not really, I don't think, fully believing it was going to work, but it did work. And so that's my point about feasibility.
Okay, so one more category. What's the argument that you've had the most success with Congress?
The Congress, as a government official, I was advocating for the refugee program because I was the Assistant Secretary for Population, Refugees, and Migration. And fortunately for me, when I was, at the State Department from 2009, from 2009 through 2011, the support for the refugee program was still very, very broad. My concern as Assistant Secretary was it was about 3 miles wide and about 2 inches deep, and we saw that in 2015 with the Paris bombings and the reaction in Congress, and now the refugee program, unfortunately, has become a bit of a political wedge issue as well, which it never was. So I wasn't dealing with border issues, but as an NGO, as the NGO lead, as the head of an advocacy organization, I have dealt with Congress a bit, and there I think where you stand on that issue in our political environment really depends on whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, and I think it's very difficult. Now, it's a real challenge to make convincing arguments. There are some Republican members, but it's very, very difficult to make convincing arguments, especially with respect to border issues, because of the politics of this issue. But again, I don't think we should stop trying, and I think we should be informed by the principles that I described earlier.
I'm thinking of your example about government officials not wanting to find out that what we were doing was less than what others were doing or was somehow violative of international agreements. And I remember once having a meeting with our former boss, in which not Sandy Berger but Tony Lake, in which he was making an argument, I think, at the IMF World Bank for greater financial aid, and particularly to the most impoverished countries in the world. And he said, we're 13th, in the world. That's pretty embarrassing. And I said, yeah, and what's really embarrassing is that we're well below the country of Ireland, to which we are giving aid, and they're giving more.
Yeah.
And he said, don't put that in the speech. Yeah. Questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for your input. I am Vera Vried. I'm a PhD researcher at the Hertie School here in Berlin. Happy to be here. And as you mentioned towards the end of your presentation, research is an important part of policy making. And I would say that a growing part of that research community is emphasizing the importance of highlighting colonial continuities and structural racism and gender in the way that displacement is caused and also in the way that policy responds to it. And so I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about that. Thank you.
I think that kind of research is extremely important. I think that that our refugee admissions programs, as well as other efforts to address, to find sort of legal avenues for forced migrants who are victims of structural discrimination. Those efforts need to be supported and accelerated. I think that I was very involved in some 20 years ago when the only way that women who are usually women who are affected by trafficking could gain admission in the United States was through a very narrow set of visas. I think it was that were really not providing avenues for protection of trafficking victims. And during the Clinton administration, we developed largely in the then Justice Department, I believe, but with the support of the National Security Council, special visas for victims of trafficking. I think the research that indicates that certain individuals face specific challenges, I think is very helpful in crafting solutions that again go beyond the traditional refugee definition.
Yes, right here. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Hello, my name is Susanne Köbel with the German news magazine Der Spiegel, and I'm also the founder of a NGO which is called the Poetry Project, which is actually giving a voice to young unaccompanied refugees coming to Germany. I'm wondering, I would like to get your view on two specific points. The role of leadership in the countries. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Here in the European Union, we see that there are some leaders who are completely rejecting the idea that they would also, taking care of their share of the refugees coming into Europe. And there are other leaders who show a mix of responsibility, a willingness, also telling their people that there's also need for people coming to European countries. That's one thing. So the role of the importance of leadership. And the second is the resentment of people against refugees. What do you think are the factors driving this resentment?
I'll have an easier time answering the first question than the second, although I will admit, I will say that I think you've answered my question in your question in the way that you asked it. There's no question. I mean, if anything that for us in the United States, that the experience of the 4 years of the Trump administration demonstrated, it was, the unbelievably important role for leadership. Most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about political issues. Depend on elites for better or worse, and rely on elites in terms of interpreting, issues that are frankly pretty complex. So I think President Trump has demonstrated the truthfulness of that statement. And so I absolutely believe that political leaders have a critical role to play in two respects. Number one, in terms of public education and identifying, the themes and constantly reinforcing them. But as importantly, I think, political leaders are in positions to change history. That's why, I've been in many meetings over the past couple of weeks, and say what you want about specific German policies at the federal level and things that Angela Merkel should have done that she didn't do. But the decision she took, on that migration issue in 2015 was not preordained. It wasn't inevitable. By that act of, to my mind, by that act of political courage, she really, changed history, and near as I can tell from where I sit, largely brought the German population along. Not completely excited about it, but in circumstances where 7 years later, most of the analysis and reporting is pretty positive. And so I think just as strong leaders, Margaret Thatcher made a huge difference. Not in many ways, not in ways that I would endorse. But I think leaders who care about the values of inclusion, of welcoming the stranger, have a critical obligation and role to play. No question about it. What are the sources of alienation and anger toward refugees? And I think it comes from fear, from fear of the other, from parts of the population often for whom changes over the past decade or several decades have created a great sense of dislocation, and circumstances where people feel just very, very threatened. But I think this contemporary phenomena is not new and unique. As I said in my remarks, it's a phenomenon that I think modern society has always had to deal with.
we were saying the other day, just as a footnote, one of the really depressing phenomena is that it's populations that have the least experience of refugees that are most hostile to them. We have seen time and again in the United States that it's the most insulated of all populations.
Yeah, there's a study that was a very good study that was done on this very issue, suggested that, if you have almost no, suggested that if you have almost no new arrivals in your community, there's not a very strong negative reaction to refugees. But if you have, but once you reach a certain level, which is still a minority, a significant minority, but not sort of on the order of 1 or 2%, that's when you people begin you begin to see much more resentment, because I think the sense of threat becomes much greater.
Andrew first, and then have Michael, Jeremy. Oh, quiet. Everyone wants to get in on the act. Right here.
Thank you so much. Andrew Gilmore, head of the Berko Foundation here in Berlin, former UN Assistant Secretary General of Human Rights. And to build on Suzanne's question, thank you, Eric, for a really very, very important and values-rich presentation. Thank you. But on this issue, I mean, there is, of course, a very high correlation between those who are anti-migrants and those who deniers of climate change. And to draw a link between some of your, I mean, you had photographs of some of the more grotesque figures of our time, the governor of Florida, the president of Hungary, the MAGA guy, all these guys were there. And all of them have in common, they deny climate change and they get their power through hating migrants. But actually they welcome it because climate change is driving migration and it strengthens their power. Now, and the figures, I mean, we have seen nothing yet. We know what happened here in 2015. It almost broke the bank. The AfD was strengthened. It contributed to the most idiotic decision ever taken by democracy in my own country the next year, i.e. Brexit. It throughout, it has a knock-on effect. And that was just 1 million. There are extremely good, I mean, likely predictions that we're going to see tens of millions of people moving. By the way, for reasons that are related to the three countries. I mean, my own country was the first to have the Industrial Revolution. Yours was the second. Our hosts were third. I mean, and that is why the carbon is in there, and that is why people are going to lead. I mean, I absolutely agree with your last slide. There's a need for public education programs, but they need to be on a vastly greater scale than anything we've ever seen to get populations prepared for what is coming, because they're not going to go to Russia, they're not going to go to China, they're going to come. The people fleeing from unimaginably painful climate conditions are going to come to Western Europe and the United States and Canada. So what do you think, based on the fact that I absolutely agree with the programs you mentioned, but they're actually relatively small scale, do you think there's any chance of really upscaling that to the degree that will be required?
Well, I think the words I used were nascent, inadequate, and underfunded. Perhaps I should have used stronger terms. But so you're not going to get an argument from me. I think that effort has to be, and right now the effort is, in the United States, it's largely being driven by non-governmental organizations, and I think the government needs to be, in this in a much more substantial way. No question about it. And I would also, I'm not a public affairs guy, but I do know that that what we're doing is encouraging, but completely inadequate. And I also think we need dynamic leaders at all levels to be speaking, not at all levels, but at least relatively senior levels, not just the President of the United States or the Chancellor here. I think you need officials at various levels making these points, about the value of inclusion. But on your issue of what do we have in front of us, I'm not sure. I mean, the best, there's no question in my mind that Europe's got to do better with respect to responsibility sharing. And if I were, if I were in the German government now, that would be a major priority for me, because I think what Germany has done and is doing, I think the number of asylum seekers that Germany will have this year will not be trivial by any means. Is very important, but I think other governments need to be pushed and pressed to do more. But I don't know what the ultimate numbers are going to look like. The best climate, the people who are most engaged on the issue of climate and migration have predicted that the bulk of migration, of forced migration as a result of climate, will be internal and not between borders. Are they correct? I don't know, but I mean they're very smart people, and this working group is composed of some of the best people in the world on these issues, are saying that the bulk of migration will be internal. Does that mean the problem is going to be any less? No, because I think the countries that are going to be experiencing this internal migration are going to be the poorer countries in the world, and that's going to be a major challenge as well.
Michael.
Thank you so much, Eric. I thought it was wonderful. I thought the presentation was both a tour de force analytically for anybody who wants to learn this issue and inspiring. I also think that you outlined various ways in which particular communities are, so to speak, doing their job. You did some really great stuff at refugees. David at the International Rescue Committee. I think we academics with the Model International Mobility Convention or Alex Alenikov are doing what academics do best, which is outlining hypothetical futures and solving abstract problems. The mayors have got together in the Mayor's Council of 20. Some companies have stepped forward, IKEA, Uniqlo, Chobani, they're out there, churches. So we have a lot of good semi-grassroots or a little bit higher than grassroots activity. But I've been struck by something that's been missing, and I wanted to get your reaction to it because you've been so much more involved in the leadership of this than we in the academic community have. And that is, a number of years ago, I asked former Vice President Biden and former Governor Jeb Bush to get together and lead an initiative on migrants and refugees in the U.S. It didn't happen for a variety of reasons. But what strikes me as most missing is the ability to put together all of these communities and have them break through some of the negative stereotyping that is being heard. And frankly, the sort of the duck and covering that we're hearing from otherwise pretty decent politicians like President Biden today. We don't have any eloquent defense coming out of migrants or refugee rights from the administration, decent as they're trying perhaps to be. What we need is leadership, is the question I'm posing to you. What Al Gore, for all of his funkiness, did for the environment for so many years, I think we need somebody or some committee. It could be Madame Merkel. She gave a good speech for the Nansen Prize last week in Geneva. Someone like that to be able to break through the noise and provide a coherent articulation of the cause of IDPs, refugees, forced migrants, and others, so that it'll be listened to in ways that it's not today. And so Mr. Trump and AFD and Ms. Maloney and others, they dominate the headlines. And we don't have a really good voice pushing back against it and claiming attention in the way that we need to do, despite all the good work that everybody else is doing. So my question is a reaction to that. Do we need, I know this sounds sad, an Al Gore for migrants, refugees, or some other person maybe even more eloquent to do it?
The answer to your question is unequivocally yes. There's no question that the missing piece here is, it shouldn't be, on this Welcome U.S. effort, the State Department was in total receive mode. They say, this is great, we love what you're doing, how can we be helpful? But they were in receive mode. It says a lot about the priority that is accorded an issue. You say a lot about the priority that's accorded an issue when you ask the question. You reveal a lot when you ask the question, where, just what you did, where is the initiative from the highest levels of government? And I think that is what's needed. I could have been even more explicit in my remarks. But I think political leadership is absolute. All these public education efforts are perhaps somewhat of the edifice on which a political leader can stand. But if the political leader isn't standing on that edifice, these public educations and engagement issues are not minimal, but are not going to be of maximum value. So to my mind, the answer to your question is yes. I think the challenge, the challenge is most political leaders right now see these sets of issues as extremely troublesome in terms of the politics of these issues. And I think that's what makes this challenge, so difficult. And but again, a lot of the questions that are being asked, I sort of feel like there's not much more I can say except yes, I agree, and I kind of thought I said a lot of it in my remarks. But I think that is the missing ingredient here. And even as an assistant secretary of state or a senior director at the National Security Council, I was making arguments to officials who were very sympathetic to the perspectives that I was often offering. But being very sympathetic is one thing. Stepping out and saying, I'm going to make this issue mine is something else altogether. And but again, I'm reminded of we had a chancellor in Germany who decided to do that against all odds. So I don't think it's impossible.
Do you think that if they were sitting around the table at the G7 and someone brought this up, the leaders around the table would say, yeah, let's get someone else to carry this water, or they would say, no, we don't want to be confronted with any more questions on this?
I don't know. I think if a head of state at a G7 meeting came in and said, we need to do something on this, I think there would be expressed sympathy for that perspective. I think the other question is, what is the it? What is it that we're going to be doing? And we haven't really, addressed that issue. But I do think Michael makes a very good point. There is a proliferation of activity, not only advocacy, but activity designed to connect, new arrivals with people who are citizens who have already been here. There's just a whole range of activity, but I think to too great an extent, government is largely an observer on a lot of this stuff, not on all of it. And I don't want to be too negative. The Biden administration has made some difficult but useful, taken some difficult but very helpful actions with respect to some of the Trump legacy issues. But it's a real challenge.
Okay, I have a bunch of hands, and I'm going to go in the order that I've seen them. But first, because I too believe in inclusion, no matter what all those people say about me, I want to ask one from one of the viewers, which is quite specific. Eric, what more can be done to address the alarming level of food insecurity among IDPs in countries such as Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Somalia?
I think that goes, I don't have a specific answer to that question other than, I would want to know, what the level of, in this instance, I think WFP, the World Food Program, would have the major responsibility. I suspect that that those places may have been subject to certain World Food Program cutbacks. I don't know that for sure, but I suspect that might be the case. So I don't know, I don't have a specific answer to that question, but it does highlight a point that I made in my remarks, which is, any effort to address the needs of internally displaced people around the world has got to be, exceptionally targeted, because their circumstances vary, so dramatically. In some places, you want to have, development-like interventions for communities that are, that aren't going anywhere, and increasingly need real opportunities to live and to thrive. In other places, you're still in a situation where you're providing humanitarian assistance to people who, on some level, you hope and expect will go back. But I'm not enough on top of the issue of I presume that in those places the World Food Program is the major provider, and I'm not on top of the issue in those places.
So right here.
Rainer Oliger. Thanks for your talk, Eric. I was wondering how you would fit, or you could fit, the larger issue of international migration, be it labor migration or family unification, into your framework of policy recommendations, given that mixed migration has become a vital issue and a very controversial issue. And Vox Populi, of course, or let's say the populist voices also tend to blur these issues, or not to distinguish between forced migration and other forms of migration. So what could be a policy response, and also one in terms of legal frameworks, because the two legal frameworks are more or less completely separate?
That's a great question, and I know that's a traditional response when someone asks a question. That's a great question, but it really is a great question. And I think I would answer it in a number of ways. First, I made reference to the pathways approach, and what that essentially is an effort to encourage governments to make use of labor migration schemes and other kinds of what might be called normal immigration channels in circumstances that might benefit people who are forced to leave. And I think there are groups in the United States who are working on those issues as well. And I think that is one example of the kind of program that the kind of initiative that your question sort of suggests. So I think those should be encouraged and strengthened. And I think UNHCR and other international organizations can play a valuable advisory role with respect to governments. For example, to mention Alex Alenikoff again, Alex and Roberto Soro had a piece in the Washington Post maybe a year or two ago, urging a major, just general migration program, not a refugee program, for Central Americans. I think the numbers may have been talking. I hope I'm not misremembering the article, but the numbers they were talking about were maybe 50,000, maybe 100,000, maybe 250,000 a year. But in a normal migration process in which those who are migrating would not, have to make a showing of persecution. So I think the kind of suggestion you're making is also appropriate in specifically tailored circumstances as well. But no matter what you're suggesting, and no matter what the value of what you're suggesting, I still think we have to have, my own view, is that we have to have sort of a separate and distinct opportunity for people who need to flee, who are forced migrants, and can be provided protection and security based on the fact that they have no choice but to leave their countries of origin. And while I think these other migration channels could be very valuable for people who are in circumstances where they need to flee, to my mind, that needs to supplant and not supplement. I mean, to supplement and not supplant an overall system of protection, ensuring the human rights of migrants who need to flee.
So we have about 6 or 7 minutes left, and I had 3 questions that I saw. Jeremy, did you still have one? So we have Jeremy, we have Suzanne. Is that you, Margaret? Margaret, yeah. Yeah, good to see you again. Okay, Jeremy. So let's take them all, and then Eric can do the classic thing of answering what he wants to.
That's always wise, yeah. I had a similar question to the numbers question that was already asked, but I maybe wanted to ask it in a slightly different way. Your presentation demonstrated that the refugee numbers in the last 10 years have more than doubled. The refugee protection regime was arguably constituted for a much smaller concept of refugees. And arguably, a lot of the political troubles that we're seeing is because of those numbers, because they are creating a greater political upset just by virtue of their size, and of course by virtue of people taking advantage of that. But still, as a professor of mine always used to say, quantity has a quality all its own. So the question becomes, if the previous questioner was right, and these numbers are likely to continue to increase at this rate, and we get to 200 million, 300 million, 400 million, 500 million refugees, which is imaginable, I think. As you pointed out, it's a sort of low percentage of the population as of now. Does this regime have to change? Would you, at any point, you sort of in your presentation advocated doubling down on this regime as the numbers have gone up. Would you at any point advocate changing it, or is it a regime that we will have to stick with no matter what that quantitative future looks like?
Don't answer that as much as you may want to.
Oh, I do want to.
Suzanne.
30 million.
Thanks so much, Eric. This was really fascinating. I have a really off-the-wall question for you, so you can't have expected this one. And it's about FEMA. This is a specifically U.S. question. And from the great state of Louisiana, where we know about climate disasters and displacement internally all the time, constantly, one wonders if FEMA isn't putting us in some kind of moral jeopardy. That is, it constantly promises we can be made whole and we can go back to where we wanted to live before. And that's just not true. And we've seen this over and over again. And I just wonder if this is a point of public policy we might also put some pressure on.
That's a great question.
I know it's one of your favorite agencies, FEMA. Dealt with a lot. Margaret.
Not a bit.
No.
Thank you very much. I join everybody else in saying this was a very fascinating presentation. I wanted to ask a question. You had on the long list of things that could be done, you had one point I would like to come back to, which is a labor market, permission to work. We talked about demand migration, which is a pick and choose system, right? I need this kind of skill and I import it from country X. Why not turn this around? And do you think that the demographic change in Europe, which has been ongoing for a long time and has now become extremely visible through shortage of labor across the board, skilled labor, can this help not to deal with 500 million, but in the short term, what would you recommend to governments which you portray a bit as observers rather than proactive managers? Labor market, education policies are clearly public policy domain.
Mr. Secretary.
Well, first, there aren't 100 million forced migrants who have crossed borders. I mean, the number's probably now about 30 to 35 million, and a lot of those people, God willing, with respect to Ukraine, will go back. So so the numbers, I also, I mean, I think, people, express real, nervousness about, oh, can we handle all these numbers? I think we really have to look at what we're dealing with. And what we're dealing with right now, it doesn't mean it's not going to be different later, but if you look at the level of increase, it's been relatively incremental. It hasn't been dramatic, hasn't been inconsequential. And you're really talking about between 25 and 30 million people. So an assumption that may underlie your comment, I think I got a sort of a challenge, because I think we don't. Right now, I have no evidence to suggest that countries of the world cannot manage this challenge with a greater degree of political will, without severe damage, without any damage to their economic and social structures. Especially when UNHCR is only saying that 1.5 million refugees are really in need of immediate resettlement. So that's my first point. My second point is, yes, I agree with you. We do need to expand our the criteria of persons who we should consider for protection. But I'm not an advocate of changing the Refugee Convention, because I think if we had a meeting to change the Refugee Convention, we'd end up with a worse document than the one we have. So we've got this organic process. We've got academics and others working in many different areas. We see expansion. We see, I got a great tutorial from an administrative law judge in Germany the other day about the various ways in which people can be protected. And I say, so I would encourage that process to go forward. And maybe at some point you get a coalition of willing governments to take up some of these ideas, but not to revisit the Refugee Convention at this point. So my answer to the second part of your question is yes, but yes. FEMA. I thought you were going to ask me a different question, Suzanne, about whether. So I'm going to answer first. I'll answer the question you didn't ask. Which is FEMA, in my experience, we wrote a report at Refugees International on FEMA's response in Puerto Rico. They're not a humanitarian operation. They don't operate like humanitarian assistance providers. And maybe in the United States, we need more of that capacity to respond in more immediate ways than FEMA has the capability of doing. But that wasn't your question. Your question was, do we have to consider whether guaranteeing, the rebuilding in environments which we know are going to be subject to significant and substantial threats in the future, is a bad idea. And of course, reasonable and smart public policy would have you look at those issues and make judgments accordingly before you actually, have to, like Vanuatu or the Maldives, and they're doing that actually. They're looking at relocation options, but I think I think it's a politically fraught issue, but I think it's really important because otherwise, we're throwing a lot of good money after bad, and that's not a great thing. And then the last question, of course, yeah. I mean, I think that sort of underlined in your question about. I think in addition to being the humane thing to do, the decision by the German government, I think, Germany has one of the lowest ratios of working age population to population of people over 65, and in the world, I think maybe they're number 3 or 4 or 5. And so I think the infusion of working age individuals who are in a position to contribute to the society is really critical. As a humanitarian, to me that's sort of a make weight argument, if you know what I mean, what we call, because I think fundamentally we have humanitarian obligations in and of themselves, but I don't think it hurts, that so many advanced, capitalist countries are having aging populations, especially a country like Germany with such a significant social insurance system. So I think yes, I think you need to look at opportunities for migrants who need protection, but I would also complement that with labor migration schemes that could benefit people who really need to get out.
Well, thank you. That was a fabulous discussion of an incredibly difficult issue.